On paper, it looks like a win-win situation. China, the global leader in the production of electric vehicles, is looking to expand its market share. But there's a problem. Many markets like the US and the EU are slapping tariffs on Chinese EVs to protect their own electric vehicle manufacturers. But there may be a way around those barriers. Türkiye, on the doorstep of the European market, is set to become the newest destination for China's EV investments. China's leading electric car manufacturer, BYD, has signed a deal with Turkey's Ministry of Industry and Technology. The $1 billion agreement was finalized just days after the EU imposed provisional tariffs of up to 38% on Chinese electric vehicles. BYD will establish a production facility for electric cars in Turkey with an annual capacity of 150,000 vehicles. The facility is expected to create up to 5,000 jobs and will start operations at the end of 2026. Given its strategic location, Türkiye, which is also banking on its domestic brand TOGG to boost its electric vehicle industry, has acted as a gateway for investors looking to access the European market. And for more on China's investments in Türkiye, joining me now from Beijing is Einar Tangen. He is a political and economic affairs analyst. And from Sydney, Mark Humphrey Jenner, an associate professor at the University of New South Wales. A warm welcome to you both, and thanks for joining me on Straight Talk. Einar, how big of an investment is this? Talk to us about the importance of this deal, both for Turkey and China.
Well, I mean, it's $1 billion investment, and it also will bring in a lot of suppliers, et cetera, who want to be close to the factory. So you're going to count on more jobs than just the ones that are provided by BYD. But, you know, you're seeing this trend around the world as geopolitical fences are erected in the West, particularly the US and Europe. China is trying to find workarounds, and those workarounds are actually helping a lot of the countries, especially in the BRICS and in the Belt and Road Initiative.
So, Mark, why has China chosen Turkey as one of its most important bases for EV production?
Well, certainly with the EU, they're looking at bringing in quite a lot of tariffs. So the EU currently has a 10% tariff on vehicles coming in, but they're looking at imposing another 17.4% to 37.6% on EVs coming in from China, allegedly to try to stop alleged dumping of cheap vehicles into EU. So BYD is effectively trying to get around those tariffs by setting up production in Turkey. So, for example, they're trying to build 150,000 units, which they're hoping are going to get around the tariffs, which would otherwise be quite expensive for BYD. Furthermore, it's going to be much closer and potentially deal with quite a lot of the geopolitical and shipping issues that China had otherwise faced getting vehicles into the EU, at least trying to mitigate that somewhat.
So, Einar, is China looking to bypass tariffs by making EVs in Turkey? I mean, is this a kind of a win-win deal?
Well, it's win-win, but it goes beyond just tariffs. You know, they have opened up a plant in Hungary. They have plants in Canada, the United States, Europe that make buses. This is a company that started in 2003, but they have global ambitions. They are the top-selling EV maker in China. They produce cars that the Europeans just cannot compete with, and that's why you're seeing these tariff walls being erected. If you can't compete, keep them out.
So, Mark, how heavily is China invested in this sector, and why?
Yeah, absolutely. China's made significant strides in the EV sector. And there's probably a few reasons for this. Of course, China has been trying to get on top of pollution itself. And as a result, EVs are one way of trying to do this, reducing smog in cities like Beijing. Part of it as well is that in the legacy auto manufacturer sector, so internal combustion engines, China had been relatively late to the game competing with legacy manufacturers in the US or in Europe. But with EVs, China has rightly noticed that they can really leap on board this new technology and be at the forefront of it. Even more the technology on a level playing field with all of the other countries. And therefore, they're not playing catch up. Rather, they're at the vanguard of rolling out EVs. And BYD, for example, is heavily leading this sector and is really competing toe-to-toe with companies like Tesla in many markets.
So, Einar, what other advantages will it bring when it comes to sharing technology, know-how, and development of this industry?
Well, that's one area where China seems to be differentiating itself from the US and Europe. They do believe in joint development. Part of this deal is setting up a research and development facility. So the idea is if you're going to have a shared future for mankind, you cannot afford to have a situation where all the IP is owned by one or two countries. Obviously, China is well ahead. They have the most engineers. They're pioneering areas from 6G to solar, but they're willing to share that. And I think this is going to have a very unique, appeal, especially to countries that were used to the idea that you have to buy it from a very wealthy country.
So, Mark, how would that help Turkey's own drive to boost its EV production at home?
It's absolutely incredibly important. And I think we need to give a lot of credit to President Erdogan here and the government in general, because getting a lot of IP collaboration within Turkey is incredibly important. And it prevents this just being a manufacturing hub. And it helps the economy be lifted up more generally. It helps IP be generated within Turkey. It creates more jobs associated with higher tier production rather than it just being manufacturing. So it's super important. It also creates additional supply chain related jobs. So not just the IP generation, but all of the other jobs associated with that, in terms of manufacturing high-tech plants, in terms of the university sector feeding in to those high-tech jobs. It's a really useful collaboration. And it's certainly something that some of the Western companies haven't really been at the forefront of doing, particularly when they've been entering into China and the converse of what we're seeing with BYD expanding externally.
So, Einar, is it likely to upset balances in the European Union as well as the US?
Well, I mean, Turkey has had an agreement since 1995 that allows it to ship things into the Europe. The question is, will the geopolitics extend to basically going after any country that cooperates with China? It's always a danger. Obviously, they put a plant in Hungary. That would be a little bit more difficult. But these are the kind of risk factors that are unfortunately keeping a lot of businessmen on the sidelines. They don't know where to put their money because the political risk is too great. Let's hope that at some point the EU realizes that they were asleep at the wheel for 12 years while China was plowing away hard. In fact, many automotive people that I know here were kind of laughing at Beijing, saying they're not going to go anywhere with that. And now all of a sudden they have, as my colleague pointed out, leapfrogged the competition. And now there's a lot of crying and how we have to protect jobs at home. I think it would have been better to do the planning in front and to be ready to compete rather than trying to get political solutions.
So, Mark, I mean, would Chinese-made EVs swarm the European markets moving forward?
Well, swarm potentially, but potentially swarm if the other manufacturers aren't keeping pace. So say we're looking at VW or we're looking at Mercedes, they have scaled back some of their EV plans. Now, arguably, that's because consumers aren't picking up EVs as much as they anticipated. But on the other hand, if they're not producing the EVs, then someone's going to fill the space. And the person filling the space might be BYD or it might be Tesla. Either way, it's not going to be the companies that are backing out of the whole sector. And they might risk falling behind quite a lot. Now, in terms of the tariffs, if the tariffs keep getting higher and higher just to try to protect the domestic sector, well, the ultimate loser could be the consumer, because the consumer will end up spending more money to have to buy something in, and will ultimately result in the European manufacturers innovating less, because they're going to be protected from external competition. So if we're just relying on tariffs to insulate the EU from a good quality product, ultimately that's not going to help the manufacturers in the long term, and it won't help the consumers, and it won't help the environmental transition.
But Mark, how would that impact European car exports to China now?
Well, European car exports have always had some challenges getting into China. Part of it's name recognition, part of it is itself tariffs and expenses going into China. So certainly the EU might be arguing that maybe their tariffs are just reciprocal for what China is doing in relation to manufacture its cars going into China. The EU manufacturers, however, are certainly going to need to make sure their product is actually compelling going into China. So, for example, if they want to compete with BYD, they need to be able to produce a product that actually competes with BYD, in China.
So, Einar, you've been mentioning the current geopolitical tensions. How would the U.S. See this deal if it proves to be a win-win situation among China, Türkiye, and Europe?
Well, Washington is not going to be happy. They've been doing their best to contain China economically and militarily and politically. So this will go against the grain. There have been clashes before between Turkey and the U.S. I don't think that this makes it better. But the fact is, we live in a world where you do not have to choose sides. China is not asking Turkey to choose China. They're simply saying, here's a trade deal. Do you want to do it? The U.S. wants all in. If you want, U.S. support, you have to support every aspect of U.S. policy. And I think that game is getting a bit old.
So, Mark, we've just mentioned this deal comes as Chinese EV markets exporting to the EU and Turkey face higher tariffs. So, was it in the making for a long time? What could you tell us about the Chinese strategy here?
Certainly, China has been trying to lay the groundwork for this for quite some time. And we've seen BYD expanding quite aggressively in many markets, not just the EU, but back here in Australia, BYD has made massive inroads. And it's obviously been in the pipe work for a little while. And I suspect that the real catalyst for this was the EU ramping up their tariffs. So certainly BYD was probably wanting to do this for a little while for various reasons, including just expanding the manufacturing footprint. But the catalyst is likely the tariffs, which are due to come in November, unless BYD manages to argue for them to not be brought in, which at this point seems to be relatively unlikely.
All right, gentlemen, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it here. Thank you very much for joining me on Straight Talk.